Okay, so today's daf is Kuf Nun Vav, which is 156. We are at the top. We had left off about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines from the top of the Amud. So it says Levi Berei de Rav Huna. Levi, the son of Rav Huna, Bar Chaya, Ashkechei legabalat de ben Nashe. He found that the person who was feeding the animals of his father's house, he saw that he was mixing the bran together with the water and feeding the animals on Shabbat. Rashi says, Morsan al yedei shinui. He was mixing the bran with water with a shinui in an unusual way, in an unusual manner, and feeding the animals that way on Shabbat. And it says, Batashbe, he kicked him, because he said, you're not supposed to do that. In other words, you're not supposed to be mixing even in an unusual way. Because remember, we learned before that it's a machloket, it's an argument between Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda, whether you're allowed to pour water over the bran and mix it in an unusual way on Shabbat. And so Levi, the son of Rav Huna Bar Chaya, thought that it wasn't allowed. So then his father came and found him. He said, this is what your father's mother said. Mishmei de Rav, in the name of Rav. Umanu, and who was his mother's father? Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. This was Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. In other words, his father said to him. So the son went and took the law into his own hands, and he kicked the worker for doing that. But then his father told him, this is what your maternal grandfather, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, said. Govlin velo misafin. You're allowed to mix this bran in an unusual way. You mix the bran with the water, but you're not allowed to force feed the animals on Shabbat. And if you have an animal that cannot yet eat with its tongue, in other words, it's a young calf who cannot eat on its own, so then mahal kitinle, then you have to force feed it. You have to push the food into its mouth because it can't eat on its own. And that's as long as you do it in an unusual manner. How do you do it in an unusual manner? Hechi mishaneh. Amar Rav Yemar bar Shalamya. Mishmei da Abaye. Rav Yemar bar Shalamya says in the name of Abaye, Sheti ve'erev. What you do is, you can put the bran and the water into the bowl together, and then you could do shetiva erev, which means you make like a cross, one vertical, one horizontal. Rashi says it means do it one time. That's it. That's all you can mix. So the Gemara asks, but wait a second, v'haloma arav shapir. That's not enough. That's not going to mix it well enough. Amar Rav Yehuda min aro lakli. What it says is that what it means is you can do shetiva erev. You can stir one time vertically, one time horizontally, like you make a cross motion, and then you can shake the vessel to mix it. Or, according to another opinion, you can pour it from one vessel to another to mix it, but you can't stir it in the normal way. So this is the way. Well, it's Shabbat, so it's they wouldn't do that every day. Yeah, it's true. So you'd have to do it. You have to do it in an unusual way to remind you that it's Shabbat. So that's how it would work. Now, so it was allowed as long as it's done in an unusual way. And force feeding is only allowed when you're doing it for the benefit of the animal. Basically, when the animal cannot eat on its own, so then you have to stick the food into its mouth as far as possible so that it will eat. So Ketiva Pinkasei de Zeiri, it was written in the journal or the ledger of Zeiri, because they used to have, the Rambam explains this actually, that they used to have notebooks that they would keep certain halachot that they asked and got answers to that weren't used as public, they weren't for public consumption, but people would have private notes about the halachot, that they would keep. So it says that he wrote in his private notes the following. Amrit Kodam Rabbi, it was said in front of Rabbi Umanu, and who's his rabbi? Who's his teacher? Rabbi Chaya. It was asked in front of Rabbi Chaya, Ma'ul Gabel, can you mix bran with water on Shabbat? Amar Asur, he said you can't. Ma'ul Farek, he said, can you take food in front of one animal and put it in front of another animal? In other words, to what extent, let's say you fed one animal, and now you want to take the leftovers and pour it in front of another animal. Is that unnecessary exertion on Shabbat? Amar Mutar, he said that's fine. You can transfer food from one animal to another. Amar Rav Menashia, Chad kamechad. Shapir. You can put one portion of food in front of one animal or two in front of two. But asur. So that you're not allowed to put 3 portions of food in front of 2 animals. In other words, 1 for 1 is enough, 2 for 2 is enough. But 3 for 2 is not necessary. So that's excessive exertion. Rav Yosef says kav vafilu kabayim. Rav Yosef says you can put a kav of food in front of, and even kabayim. Ula amar kur vafilu kurayim. In other words, according to these last two opinions of Rav Yosef and Ula, there's no limit. Put as much as you want. Once you're feeding them, feed them as much as you want. There's no quantitative limit according to these last two opinions. Ketiva Pinkasei de Levi, it said, it was written in the diary or in the private notes of Levi. Amrit Kodam Rabbi. It was said in front of Rabbi. Omanu Rabbeinu HaKadosh. And who was the Rabbi? Who was the teacher of Levi? Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Okay, Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Tahavu Gavlin Shatita Bebavel. Vavatzavach Rabbi. The Umanu Rabbeinu HaKadosh al dahavu gavlin shatita, that they used to mix this shatita. We said this shatita before is a type of drink that was made of vinegar and toasted flour, and they would mix it up into a type of thick mixture on Shabbat. And they would do this in Babylonia, and Rabbeinu HaKadosh did not like it. He complained about it. However, but nobody would listen to him. And there was no way he could prohibit it, even though he wanted to. Because Rabbi Yehuda, like we learned before, allowed you to mix the thick shatita as long as you did it in smaller quantities. He said it was allowed. And the thin, everybody allowed you to do. Right? That was something that we learned yesterday. So you're allowed to do the thin one in an unusual way, as long as you put the grain first and then you pour the vinegar over it. The thick one, according to Rabbi, you weren't allowed to do it at all. According to Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, you were allowed to do it in small quantities. So that's what they were following in Babylonia. They were making it. And Rabbi did not like that. Ketiva Piksei Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, it was stated in the ledger or in the diary of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Hai man de bechad b'shabbat, somebody who was born, okay, on the first day of the week, meaning on Sunday, Yehei givar velo chadabe. He will be a man that doesn't have one in him. What does that mean? My velo chadabe, what does that mean? Ilema velo chadativu. If you're telling me that means he won't have one good thing in him. Ve'amar Rav Ashi, but Rav Ashi says, Ana b'chad b'shabbat havai. But Rav Ashi himself was born on Sunday, and he wasn't a bad guy. He must have had something good about him. So ela lav chada levishu. What does it mean? Does it mean that a person who's born on Sunday won't have one bad thing about them? Ve'amar Rav Ashi, but Rav Ashi says, Ana v'dimi bar kakuzta havyan b'chad b'shabbat. Ana melech v'hu avaresh ganave. That Rav Ashi said that I and Dimi bar kakuzta were both born on Sunday. I became a king, meaning I'm one of the rabbinic leaders, and he became the leader of the thieves. He was the mob. He was like the Godfather or something. Yeah, the mafia leader, right? So we're both leaders. So Rashi says that means that somebody who's born on Sunday will be a leader of something. Okay, either good or bad. What it means is that either he'll turn out to be totally good or totally bad. If he's born on Sunday, he'll be the leader of something. He'll be outstanding in something. The something might not be good. Now it says in the parentheses here, and some people remove this, but it says that what's the reason? That just like light and darkness, two polar opposites were created on Sunday, so two polar opposites are born on Sunday. What if a person was born on Monday? He's going to be angry. What's the reason? Because this is the day that the waters were split. And angry people, they create a lot of division, right? They cause a lot of trouble. What? Yeah, I guess so, yeah, but overly so. Right? If you were born on Tuesday, you'll be rich, but you'll also be promiscuous. You'll have a lot of material wealth and a lot of sensual involvement. What's the reason? Mishum de ivru be'asavim, because this was when the grass was created. Now, according to Rashi, he gives two different reasons why that would be relevant. Why would the grass be relevant? Either because of the promiscuity, because there's a lot of growth, because the grass grows and grows and grows, or because it doesn't say liminehu. All of the animals, it says this animal was created according to its species. But in the grasses, it doesn't say that, because grasses will go even shelo liminehu, even not with their type. And the promiscuity, adultery, is people going not with the person that belongs to them, or to whom they belong. If a person's born on Wednesday, he will be a wise and enlightening person. What's the reason? Because that was the day that the sun and the moon were stationed in the sky. So that's light shining. He'll be a wise person. He shines light. A person who is born on Thursday will be a Baal Chesed. He'll be somebody who does a lot of charity and kindness. My time, what's the reason? Because this was the day that the fish and the birds were created. And Rashi says, what do the fish and birds have to do with being kind? Because they are supported only by the kindness of Hashem. Because they don't work. You don't domesticate fish. You don't domesticate birds in the same way. You don't put them to work like oxen or something like that. So they don't work for a living. They rely on Hashem's chesed. And so a person who's born on Thursday will be a person who is gomel chesed. A person who is born on Friday will be a very persistent person. What does it mean, a person who's very persistent? Meaning you'll be very persistent about doing the mitzvot. Why? Because Friday is a day that you're tied up doing mitzvot for Shabbat all day long. Right? You're always involved in getting ready for Shabbat and doing the mitzvot related to Shabbat. So too, a person who's born on Friday will be very persistent about doing mitzvot. A person who's born on Shabbat itself, a person who's born on Shabbat, will die on Shabbat. Because they had to desecrate Shabbat when he was born, so he dies on Shabbat. So he's good. Yeah. Amar Rav Bar Rav Shila. But he will also be, according to Rav Bar Rav Shila, a very holy person. If he's born on Shabbat, he has the ability to be a very holy person. Now, incidentally, all of these things, the Mefarshim explained, they're not givens. In other words, these are the natural inclinations of the person, but you still have free choice. So even if you're born on Shabbat, that doesn't mean everybody born on Shabbat is a holy person. It means they have the ability to be a very holy person. They have the tendency to be very promiscuous if they were born on a certain day. But that doesn't mean that they're automatically going to be that way. They could still control themselves. Now, there's a critique here. Amar lahu Rabbi Chanina said, Puku imru lebar Levi. Go out and tell the son of Levi, because remember, this was all from Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, all of this description of what you're going to be like if you're born on the different days of the week. He said, go tell him, Lo mazal yom gorem, ela mazal sha'a gorem. It's not the mazal of the day of the week, it's the mazal of the hour of the day that makes a difference. Now, because they had a concept that there were 7 hours that continually repeated. So let's say you started at the first hour of the day. That was hour 1, hour 2, hour 3, hour 4, hour 5, hour 6, hour 7. And then in the 8th hour, it would be again 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 throughout the week. So it was a constant cycle. Actually, in one of the Gemarot, there was in the Steinsaltz, I looked, he had a nice chart that shows starting in the beginning of the week on Sunday, first hour, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there are 24 hours in a day, but only 21 hours. There are only 7 hours in the cycle, so in a given day you end up traversing 3.5 cycles, basically, because you only have 24 hours, and then you would start on hour number 4 on day 2 as your first hour of the day, and so on. In other words, the 7 hours continue cycling regardless of the day, starting from the beginning of Sunday.
It's not really to coordinate with the day.
No.
Like the 7 days and 7 hours.
Right, no. No, not at all. It's just a continuous cycle of hours. So he says, if you're born on the hour of the sun, which is the first hour, you will be a bright person who shines. You'll eat and drink of your own, meaning you won't rely on others, because the sun shines its own light. But your secrets will be revealed. Don't try to have a secret life. If you try to steal, you won't succeed. Because the sun, like they say, sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? The saying, right? Sunlight is nothing can hide from the sunlight. Somebody is born during the hour of Venus. This was the second hour. So then, then he's going to be a person who is wealthy and promiscuous. Why? Because there's a lot of fire, of passion associated with Venus. So that hour is going to make you passionate. A person who's born during the Mercury hour, that's the third hour, you're going to be a very strong and a very radiant and wise person. Nahar v'chakim. I was looking at gavar. It's gever nehir v'chakim. You're going to be a gevar nehir v'chakim means you're going to be a person who is bright, shining, and wise. Mishum desafra dechamahu, because Mercury follows the sun around. Okay, that's what they said. Hi bande bilavana. Now the fourth hour is called the hour of the moon. If you're born during that hour, you're going to suffer a lot. Banai v'satir banai. You will build and it will be destroyed. You will destroy and it will be rebuilt, just like the moon waxes and wanes. And achil de lo delay, v'shadid de la delay. You will eat and drink what doesn't belong to you. In other words, others will give you food. You will rely on the kindness of others, just like the moon only shines because of the light of the sun. Ve'razoi kasyan, but you'll be able to hide your secrets. And im ganav matzlach, if you steal, you'll succeed. Because the moon can conceal itself, right? It becomes concealed during the new moon, or prior to the new moon. Hayman de b'shabbatai, if you're born during Shabbatai, this is Saturn, the hour of Saturn. Yigivar machashavte betelin. There'll be a person whose plans fail. Some say call them a hashvin alei betelin. Some say you'll be a person that if others plan against you, they will fail, rather than you failing. If you were born during the Jupiter hour, you will be a righteous person. What it means is, you will be righteous in your performance of mitzvot. In other words, you will be very principled, just like before we said that you will be. He said that you will be a chazran b'mitzvot. You will be somebody persistent in doing the mitzvot. Here he says you will be a tzadkan. You will be righteous. And Rashi says tzedakah la'aniyim. You will be giving a lot of tzedakah. You will be a charitable person. Hayman b'madim. If you're born under Mars, that hour, yigivar ashid dama. You will be a person who spills blood. Amar Ravashi says you will either be a doctor, a thief, a butcher, or a mohel. So you could spill blood either in a good way or a bad way. Amar Rabba says, I was born during Madim, I was born during Mars. Amar Rabba Yabar said, Marnami, Anish v'katil. He said, because I guess Rabba was saying, hey, I was born during Mars, and I'm not a mohel, I'm not a butcher, I'm not a thief, and I'm not a doctor, so what about me? So he said to him, well, you also punish people and kill people, because Rabbah was a leader. He had political power. So since he punished people, he would have them whipped or he would have them killed. So that's also a type of spilling blood. Itmar, it was stated, Rabbi Chanina says, Mazal machkim, Mazal ma'ashir, v'yesh mazal Yisrael. That the mazal that you're born under, in other words, we could think of it as, nowadays we would say genetics. Right? In other words, they were talking about natural determinism, right? Determinism. So they've thought about it in terms of mazal. Today, it's like the way people say genetics. Oh, I was born this way. I can't help it. My genetics compelled me to be this or to be that. So it's the same concept. He's saying that yesh mazal Yisrael, that it will determine whether you're smart or you're rich. Astrology will determine it. And yesh mazal Yisrael. And even though you're a Jew, it will still affect you. Just like today we would talk about genetics determining who you're going to be like. You will say, well, I can't help it. I was genetically wired to be very musical. I was genetically wired to be very aggressive. I was genetically wired to be very smart, or whatever. Okay, so these things could be translated into our terms. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Ein mazal Yisrael." Rabbi Yochanan says, "Mazal doesn't apply to the Jewish people." All of these things we said so far are just the naturalistic determinism, but the Jews are above the naturalistic determinism. We operate on a different plane. Rabbi Yochanan is consistent with his reasoning because Rabbi Yochanan said, "Midayin she'ein mazal Yisrael." How do we know that there's no mazal for the Jewish people? Shene'emar ko amar Hashem. Because it says, so says Hashem, El derech hagoyim, that the way of the people, in other words, the ways of the nations of the world, al tilmadu, don't learn. In other words, don't learn their ways. Umeotot hashamayim al techatu, and don't be afraid of the signs of the nations. Okay? Or the signs of the heavens. Because that is what the non-Jews are afraid of. In other words, whatever signs you see in the heavens, whatever the astrologers say, whatever the stargazers say, don't believe them. The other nations of the world can be worried about it, but not us. Right? They should be afraid, but not the Jewish people, because for us it doesn't matter. And similarly, Rab said there's no mazal for the Jewish people. Because Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, how do you know that mazal doesn't apply to the Jewish people? That he took Abraham out to show him the stars, remember? And he said, just like the stars, that's how your descendants are going to be. Amar Abraham lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Abraham said before Hashem, Ribono shel olam, Master of the worlds, Ben Beiti Oreshoti, my assistant, the manager of my household, Eliezer, is going to inherit me. Amar lo, he said, Lav. It should be ki'im, right? It's going to be one that comes out of your loins. In other words, Hashem said to him, you're wrong. It's going to be your own descendants. Amar Lefanav, he said before him, Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the world. I checked out my astrological reading, and it says that I'm not going to have any children. Amar Le said to him, go out from your astrology. So that's why he said, he took him out, means he took him out of the framework of thinking. He thought that his destiny was determined by the stars, we would say by genetics, by whatever. He thought it was determined. Hashem said to him, no, it is not determined. You could, because in Mazal Yisrael. So when people complain that they have bad mazal, tell them in Mazal Yisrael there's no mazal. It's up to you. My datech, what are you thinking? Said Hashem to Abraham. Dekai tzedek b'ma'arav. That tzedek, Jupiter, which is your mazal, you were born under the star of Jupiter. Under the hour of Jupiter. So it was in the west. Shu makom mitzunan. That Rashi says it was a cold place. And in other words, since it was in the west when you were born, Jupiter, that means that you're not going to have any children. He said to him, Hadrana umokmina le b'mizrach. I moved it, and I can move it and put it into the east. And that's why it says, that's what it says in the pasuk. Who awakened from the east, tzedek, righteousness. Right. So, but here it means Jupiter. In other words, who brought Jupiter from the east? Liraglo, because of him. And the way that the Gemara is interpreting it is, Hashem summoned Jupiter to be in the east, so that Abraham would have Jupiter in the east, and that would mean that he could have children. In other words, Hashem
made it work.
Right. So, in other words, basically, Hashem can manipulate. The reason why in Mazal Yisrael is because Hashem can manipulate all those factors that we think are set in stone. We think they're predetermined, but they're really under the control of Hashem. So, even though it might be true that Abraham was born under forces or under influences that would normally determine that a person wouldn't have children, since Hashem has control over those forces, He can overpower them and reset them.
So it's not determinism versus free will. It's determinism versus special determinism.
Right, that Hashem can change it. That there's hashgacha pratit. There's individual providence. There's providence for the Jewish people that most people are under. Statistics will. That's another thing. Actually, the rabbi mentioned it last night. I mean, if you look at statistics, all the other nations follow statistics. I mean, you'll see that the number of, like, he gave the amount of Nobel Prize winners as an example. That we're 0.23%. We're not even a quarter of 1% of the population. But we have 23% of the Nobel Prizes or whatever. So that's the other nations, they follow what you would normally expect. If their population is 1%, then 1% or less of Nobel Prizes are awarded, and so on. So statistics make a difference. And explain the patterns of other nations, but not the Jewish people, because they're under a different system.
So the direct involvement of God versus the non-direct involvement.
Right. And Shmuel also said that there's no mazal for the Jewish people, but we're going to see that this direct involvement is still predicated on free will, though. That the person is a tzaddik. We'll see some examples here. The Shmuel v'Avlet, because Shmuel and Avlet havu yatvei, they were once sitting. Avlet was a non-Jewish astrologer. They were sitting. And there were people who were walking by, going down to the swamp. The astrologer said to Shmuel, that guy that just passed, he's not going to come back, because a snake is going to bite him and he's going to die. Shmuel said, if he's a Jew, he's going to come back. He's not going to be bitten. After they had been sitting there, Shmuel was right. That guy came back. Avlet, the astrologer, was so certain of his prediction that he couldn't believe what he saw, that the guy came back. So what did he do? He went up to the guy and he took his basket off of his shoulder. He saw that inside the basket of reeds that this guy had cut was a snake cut in half. So he had sliced the snake in half while he was cutting the reeds. That snake would have bitten him. It would have been in his basket, would have bitten him, but he cut it. Shmuel said to him, what did you do to deserve this special miracle that was done for you? He told him, every day we sit around And we, the group of whatever they were, reed cutters, would put bread in a basket. In other words, everyone would make a contribution each day to the collective meal, to the communal meal. It was potluck lunch. We had a potluck lunch. V'achlinan, and we would all eat. Ha'idana today, ha'idana hava, ika chad minan, delo hava lerifta. There was one guy who showed up, he didn't have any bread. He didn't have anything to contribute, and I knew he didn't have anything to contribute. So, Havaka Michsaf, he was embarrassed. So, Amina lo, I said to everybody, Anaka imna va'armina, I'm going to do the collection today, because every day they would have somebody else go around and collect the food from everybody for the potluck. And then they would set it out for everybody. He said, I'm going to do the collection today. When I got up to him, I pretended that I took something from him, but really, so that he wouldn't be embarrassed. But really, what did he do? He put in more from himself. He added more from himself for the communal plate. But so in other words, he covered up for this guy. Amar le mitzvah avadet. He said, you did a mitzvah. Nafak Shmuel v'darash. Shmuel went out and said, Utzedakah tatzil mimavet. That you see that tzedakah, charity, saves from death. Because look, this guy would have died from a snake bite, but because he did this mitzvah of caring for somebody else, he was saved. V'lo mimita mishuna, ela b'mita atzma. Not only does it save you from dying a terrible death, it saves you from even a normal death. We also know from the story of Rabbi Akiva that there's no mazal for the Jewish people. Because Rabbi Akiva had a daughter, that the day she gets married, this famous story, Rabbi Akiva was told by astrologers that the day that his daughter would get married, she would be bitten by a snake and she would die. His whole life he was probably worried about that, right? Because he had heard this terrible prediction. Shakleta lemechavanta datzta beguda itrame etev lebe'ene dechivya. So what ended up happening was that his daughter, the day of her wedding, took the some kind of a pin or whatever, a brooch, whatever it was, and she stuck it into the wall to hang it there. That's tabegudah. She put it into the wall, and it happened. It went right into the eyes of the snake. So Litzafra in the morning, when she went to pull out the brooch from the wall where she had stuck it, she pulled it out and saw a dead snake hanging from it, which probably wasn't very pleasant to find, but still better than a living snake. Amar Allah, her father said to her, "My avadet, what did you do?" Amar Allah, she said to him, "Bepanya, in the afternoon of the wedding day, ata anya, there was a poor person who came to the door in the middle of our seudah. They were having the party, the reception, we would call it today. They were having the wedding reception in the house. And some poor person knocked at the door and nobody could hear because they were all partying. But I heard, Ka'imna, I stood up, Shakalti l'ristanai, I took my portion from the wedding feast, and then, Diahivitle, Yahevteni hale, and what was given to me, I gave to him. Okay, in other words, the special portion that was given to me, I gave to him. Amarla, he said to her, mitzvah avadet, you did a mitzvah, nafak Rabbi Akiva v'darash, ustaka tatil mimavet, v'mimita mishuna, ela b'mita atzma, that you see from this, that tzedakah saves. He went out and told everybody, tzedakah saves you from death, not only from a bad death, but any death, because, look, she was destined to die from the day she was born, on this day, and she was still saved, despite the astrological prediction that was years and years, prior. All because of what seemed like a chance occurrence. But why did the chance occurrence happen? Because in Mazal Yisrael, because when we do mitzvot, we have special providence from God. And this girl, on her wedding day, instead of being self-indulgent and saying, this is my day, I'm the center of focus, she went and she took care of a poor person knocking at the door, which is really remarkable. There was actually a story about, I think it was the Od Yosef Chai, the person who started the Od Yosef Chai, that on his wedding day, as soon as the wedding was over, he went back on the street to collect for poor people, because he was a mishulach who collected for poor people, to provide for poor people. On his wedding day, he went with his, suit, whatever he wore. He was a chassid, but with the fancy, bekisha. Yeah, with the fancy thing that he wore for his wedding, he went out and collected tzedakah on the day of his wedding. So that's the same thing.
So there is mazal. But that's not the final determinant.
That's not the final determinant, right? Because we do mitzvah, we have a different way of having zechut, basically. And we also see that there's no mazal for the Jewish people from the story of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, which should give hope to any person, no matter what their genetic determinants are, from this story. Because the astrologers told the mother of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak that Barich, your son, ganavahava, he's going to be a thief, a terrible thief. So, what did she do? Lo shivakte galuye reshe. She never allowed him to uncover his head. In other words, she kept the kippah on his head his whole life. Amrale, she said, Kaseh reshech, cover your head. Kiechi detehevu alach emata dishmaya. This is where kippah comes from. One of two sources. I think there's only one other one. One of at least two sources, let's say, for the concept of a kippah. So she forced him to wear a kippah and said, keep a kippah on your head so that you'll have the fear of God upon you. And she prayed. Okay? And pray. So she was talking to him. In other words, keep this kippah on your head and pray for Hashem to have mercy on you and have fear and have His fear upon you all the time. Lo havayada amayka amrale. He never understood, why did she always tell him to keep his head covered and to pray for himself? Yom achad, one day, yativ kagarish tute dikla. He was sitting and he was learning underneath a palm tree or a date palm. So nafal glima me'ilave reshe. His head covering fell off of his head. Dale ene, he lowered his eyes. Chazal dikla, and he realized that in front of him was a date tree. Al me yitzrei, his yetzer hara overpowered him. Salik paskei lekibura b'shineh. He climbed up the tree and he bit off a cluster of dates with his teeth, even though the date tree didn't belong to him. In other words, he stole it. He stole the dates. Why did that happen? Because he lost his fear of heaven for a second. But what's the point here? The point is that a person might have obviously he had an extremely strong natural inclination to be a thief. He was a kleptomaniac. That's what we would call it today. He had kleptomania. He was extremely, compelled to be a thief. By deterministic rules, he would be a thief. But because he had the fear of Hashem on him, he was able to overcome it. If he lost the fear of Hashem, the natural tendency would burst forth again. But this just shows you that we have a capacity to overcome even the strong. Look at how powerful it was, and yet he had the ability to overcome it through keeping the fear of God on him all the time. The Mishnah says, we've seen this Mishnah before, it's appeared a couple of times. You can cut nevela, you can cut meat of an animal in front of other animals to feed them. I'm sorry. You can cut gourds in front of animals, and you can cut the meat in front of the dogs. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Im lo hayta nevela me'erev Shabbat asura lefi sheina min hamuchan. This is the classic machloket between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. Here, Rabbi Shimon is the anonymous one. Rabbi Shimon holds that something that was not accessible on erev Shabbat, but becomes accessible to you on Shabbat, you're allowed to use it anyway. So therefore, if let's say you had an animal that died on Shabbat, so on Erev Shabbat you couldn't have used it for meat, it hadn't died yet, but it died on Shabbat, and now you want to use it for dog food, you're allowed to. It's not kosher because it died without shechita. But you're allowed to. Rabbi Yehuda says no, if it didn't die before Shabbat, then it wasn't prepared for dog food before Shabbat. It was a living animal before Shabbat. And since it was a living animal when Shabbat started, it's muktzeh for the whole Shabbat. Rabbi Shimon said, no, it was muktzeh at the beginning of Shabbat because it was a living thing, but as soon as it dies, now it's free game. You can use it now. Okay, so now the Gemara says, Itmar, it was stated, and we have a siman in parentheses here. Arel, shachaz siman. We're going to follow the letters, ayin, resh, lamed, shin, chet, zayin. That was a mnemonic to remember the order of the upcoming statements. Amar Ula. Ula is from Arel, the first ayin, right? What does Ula say? Halacha Rabbi Yehuda. The halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. Fa'af Rav. That's the resh in Arel. And Rav also said halacha Rabbi Yehuda. The halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. So Ula said that in our Mishnah the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, namely that if the animal didn't die before Shabbat and it died on Shabbat, you can't use the meat to feed the dogs. And Rav also said the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. Midekarche dezuzeh de Rav asaru shmuel sharei, because when it comes to mats that were used to cover the merchandise on ships, they are muktzeh because they are set aside for covering merchandise. Let's say you wanted to use them for sitting on Shabbat. Shmuel says that you can use it because they're useful, they're capable of being used. In other words, we look at the potential. They're capable of being used for sitting anytime. It just happens to be that you designated them for covering the merchandise. So you use them for sitting, no problem. Rav says, no, since they were designated for merchandise, covering merchandise, you can't change the designation on Shabbat. So he's holding like Rabbi Yehuda, the strict view of Muktzeh, that whatever it is when Shabbat starts is what it is for Shabbat, that's it. Va'af Levi savar halach Rabbi Yehuda. This is the lamed of the Siman Arel, right? Lamed is Levi. Levi agrees with Rabbi Yehuda. Ki had Levi ki umayte terefta lekabeh b'yom tava. When they would bring a terefa in front of him on Yom Tov, they would bring animals to Levi to say, "Can you eat it or not?" In other words, they would do the shechita, and then you would have to examine to see if it's a terefa, to see if it had any defects inside that would make it a terefa. They would come to Levi to assess the situation. And he would tell them, he would tell them, come ask me at the garbage dump. Why? Because if they did shechita and found that it was a terefa, now they have to leave it in the garbage dump. Now wait a second, why can't we say, no, feed it to the dogs? Feed it to the dogs. So you see that Levi holds like Rabbi Yehuda. Since it was alive, even when Yom Tov started, what was it designated for? Human consumption. You can't now switch it to animal consumption. So Ushmuel Amar Shmuel says, now we come to the second one, Shachaz. There was Arel and Shachaz. Arel were the three rabbis who said like Rabbi Yehuda. Shachaz is going to be who holds like Rabbi Shimon. So Shmuel says halachak Rabbi Shimon, Vafziri savar halachak Rabbi Shimon. Shmuel also says, I'm sorry, I skipped the line. That Levi said that you had to do the shechita by the garbage dump because he said if we find out that it's not kasher for humans, it's not good for animals either because it was designated for humans before. Okay, now Shmuel Amar halachak Rabbi Shimon. Shmuel says halachak Rabbi Shimon. V'avziri savar halachak Rabbi Shimon. And Ziri also says that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon. It's not as we learned in the Mishnah. That an animal that died, don't move it from its place. Because Ziri said that's only talking about a korban. Right, yeah. A korban that dies, you can't move. Why? Because it's totally mukteh, because you can't eat it, obviously. You can't feed it to a dog because it's a korban. So you can't move it. But chulin, if an animal dies on Yom Tov or Shabbat, and it was a regular animal, it wasn't a korban, then you could move it. Why? Because you could feed it to the dogs. So you see that Ziri holds like Rabbi Shimon, the lenient view. Just like we knew that Shmuel did, because Shmuel was the one that said you can use the mats that cover merchandise on the ship to sit on. And, right, Avaf Rabbi Yochanan, Shachaz is the chet, is Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan also says, Amar halachak Rabbi Shimon. That the Chavaz Rabbi Shimon. We Amar Rabbi Yochanan hachi. Is that really true that Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rabbi Shimon? Ve'amar Rabbi Yochanan lachak is the Mishnah. This is the classic question. They always ask about Rabbi Yochanan throughout the Shas, right? How could Rabbi Yochanan say that? Rabbi Yochanan says that we always follow an anonymous Mishnah. And Utnanan, it says in the Mishnah, in Mevakin Eitim min hakorot velo min hakora shenishbara b'yom tov. And it says in an anonymous Mishnah that you're not allowed to take wood from the korot, from the boards that were set aside to build, velo min hakora shenishbara b'yom tov, and you can't take from a board that was broken on Yom Tov, that had another designation. And now it broke, and you want to use these for burning. In other words, you want to use them for the fire because you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov. So you want to take a piece of wood that would have been used for binyan, for building, and use it for the fire. Or you want to take a board that broke, you want to use it for the fire now. So it says in the Mishnah you can't do that because they were designated for building before. Okay? So how can Rabbi Yochanan not? So Rabbi Yochanan has to accept that because it's an anonymous Mishnah. So how can Rabbi Yochanan say that we follow Rabbi Shimon when this Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon should say that you're allowed to take the boards and use them for firewood on Yom Tov, because he says that it doesn't matter what your designation was before Yom Tov. It doesn't matter. You changed it. So the answer is, Hahu Rabbi Yochanan, Hahu Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda matnela. Rabbi Yochanan had a different version of that Mishnah. He said that Mishnah that holds like Rabbi Yehuda, the strict version of Muktzeh, is following Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. It says Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda in his version. Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda and Mevakin Eitim min hakorot. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it's not anonymous. Tashma, come and listen. Matchilin ba'arimat teven v'lo ba'etzim sheba Muktzeh. It says you can start if you have a pile of straw and you want to use this straw, let's say, for burning, you want to burn the straw, and we have straw that's set aside for burning, for combustion, right? We want to burn it. Or etzim sheba muktzeh. Here the word muktzeh means in the backyard where they would have storage. They would have like a shed, like we would have a shed in our backyard. They would have like a backyard where they would keep stuff. So it says, aval lo etzim min muktzeh. You can't take wood that was put in the shed because that wood was being saved for binyan, for building. So again, it's an anonymous Mishnah that says that unless the thing was designated for burning before Yom Tov, you can't use it. That's a different story, says Rabbi Yochanan. That's not ordinary muktzeh. Ordinary muktzeh, Rabbi Shimon would say you can change the designation, and we hold like Rabbi Shimon, and he says you can change the designation even on Shabbat and even on Yom Tov. But this is muktzeh because of it's too expensive. Okay? What does that mean? It means it's something so expensive that you would never think of using it for any other purpose than the one it's designated for. Under normal circumstances, you never would. So even Rabbi Shimon says, we don't look at all the potential uses of that thing, because you would never really look at the potential uses of that thing. You would never think of changing its designation. And even though in this particular case, this individual wants to, we say because it's something so expensive that a normal person would never use it for anything but what it's designed for, that's no good. Because even Rabbi Shimon agrees that in that case it's muktzeh. Tashima, come in here. Ein mashkin v'shochatin et hamidbariyot, aval mashkin v'shochatin et habaitot. This is from Masekhet Betzah. It says that if you have animals that are free-range animals, you cannot give them to drink and then slaughter them on Yom Tov. Because what might you think? You're allowed to slaughter on Yom Tov. So if I have an animal that's not, that's freely roaming in the, in the outside, and I lead it home, and I give it some drink, because they used to give it water, because they said that if you give it liquid, then when they skin the animal, it came off more easily. I'm not sure what that's based on, but they said if they gave it drink, that it would be skinned more easily. So you can't take these free-range roaming animals. You can only slaughter animals that are domesticated, that belong to you and are on your farm. But you can't go get an animal from the outside. What's the reason? Apparently because they're muktzeh. They weren't designated for your use before Yom Tov. The animal's wandering. You see an ox wandering, it's not, it's free. So it's a free wandering animal. So it's muktzeh because it wasn't designated for use before Yom Tov. So that's an anonymous Mishnah that supports Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon would say, who cares if it was designated for your use? We assume you want to use anything you're going to find on Yom Tov, for whatever purpose. Rabbi Yochanan found another Stam Mishnah to support him. Beit Shammai this was in our Masechet. Beit Shammai says you can pick up bones and you can pick up shells off of the table. And Beit Hillel said, no, you can't directly pick up the shells and the bones off the table. You have to shake out the tablecloth and let them fall. Rav Nachman said there's an error here. That really it should be switched. Beit Hillel is the lenient one. Beit Shammai is the strict one. So since Beit Hillel in the Mishnah supports the position of Rabbi Shimon that's lenient about muktzeh, that's Rabbi Yochanan's basis for accepting that as the halacha. Peligiba, there was an argument. Rav Acha and Ravina had an argument. That in all areas of muktzeh we follow Rabbi Shimon except for one thing. Muktzeh mechamat mius, which means something disgusting. What's the case of something disgusting? An earthenware candle that's already been used, because they would become greasy and really something that you would never use for any other purpose. Definitely muktzeh. So even though Rabbi Shimon might not hold of muktzeh mechamat mius, we add that to the list. We hold like Rabbi Shimon leniently in all other muktzeh, but in this we're stringent. Ve'chad amar, and another one said muktzeh mechamat mius nami alachak Rabbi Shimon, and the other one said that no, even when it comes to disgustingness, we don't take aesthetic muktzeh, something which is distasteful, like an old candle that's been used with oil and it absorbs into the earthenware and it becomes greasy, and that even though it's disgusting, you could still use it if you want to for some permitted purpose on Shabbat. However, levar mi muktzeh mechamat isur. However, when it comes to muktzeh mechamat isur, umaynihu ner shidliku ba be'ota Shabbat, that according to Rabbi Shimon, that's permitted. In other words, if you lit a candle in a candlestick on Friday, and it burned out over Shabbat, according to Rabbi Shimon, you want to use that candlestick for something else? No problem. But that's the one thing we disagree with him on. We follow him on everything, except for that one thing. אבל מוקצה מחמת חיסרון כיס אפילו רבי שמעון מודה, דתנן כל הקים ניתנים בשבת, חוץ ממסר הגדול ויתד של מחרשה. However, everybody agrees that there's one kind of muktzeh that even Rabbi Shimon adopts, and that is muktzeh mechamat chisaron kis, like we said, something which is so expensive, so delicate of an instrument, like a surgical knife. Okay, nobody's ever going to use a surgical knife or a Brit Milah knife. Nobody's going to say, pass the Brit Milah knife, I want to cut my steak. No, because it's, it's so delicate, you're not going to use it. So it says Masar Gadol. He's talking about here a type of saw that was used to cut wood. It had to be precisely serrated. They didn't want to ever get any nicks in this type of saw. Or yatichel macharesha, or the plowing tool that plows the ground. They didn't want it to become nicked or ruined, so they would never use it for anything else. So something which is an expensive and delicate tool that you would never use for anything else. Even Rabbi Shimon agrees that's the only thing we see. We don't look at the potential for multiple use. But anything else, we look at the potential for multiple use. And there was a machloket here between Ravina and Ravina and Rav Acha. Which other case should we add onto the list? We hold like Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon generally is very lenient about muktzeh, although he does agree with muktzeh mechamat chisaron kis. He agrees that things that are very expensive and delicate are muktzeh. But what additional things should we add to the list? Should we add to the list also things which are disgusting aesthetically? Or should we? No, we shouldn't add that to the list either. We should only add to the list things which were muktzeh mechamat isur. Things like a burning candle that was burning on Shabbat and went out on Shabbat, that's muktzeh. And the halacha is that that's what we follow. We say that something which is a candle that was lit on Friday night, you can't move the candlestick even after the fire goes out because it's muktzeh mechamat isur. Even though in many other ways we're lenient about muktzeh, on this one, in this area we are stringent. We adopt the stringent position even against Rabbi Shimon.